Gear is a local shepherd, but he comes from a long line of gold prospectors, and he spends much of his spare time panning the nearby rivers. He knows this river well, and it still yields gold, as he proves with a quick swirl of his pan. But I want to see the traditional method, the old-fashioned way they used to fleece for gold. At first, it looks like an ordinary sluice, but at the bottom is a sheepskin, a fleece. So if you place the sluice in a stream of fast-moving water and shovel in your slurry, in theory the lighter gravel should be swept over it and away, while the heavier gold sinks and gets caught in the fleece. There's certainly gold in these rivers, and a few people know where to find it, but Gear's in no hurry to tell us where it is.
The video extract is part of a timeline documentary called Search for Jason and the Argonauts. I will leave a link in the description for those who want to watch it. It is certainly worth it. This shows how the traditional mining of gold using a sheepskin is still done to this day, and Georgia and its people are beautiful. So, and this will be part 2 on the symbolism used on the chain worn by members of the Order of the Golden Fleece. The origins of the fleece is more or less known now, but there is an alternative connection that I haven't spoken of before, but that does get mentioned in history. There is a connection with Gideon, although sometimes called Jerubbaal or Jerubishet, which is in this case meaning the great leader appointed by God. So he is a biblical figure who appears in the book of Judges as the 5th judge appointed by God. His duty is to liberate the Israelites of the Amalekites and Midianites, and he tests out the order of his God twice using a fleece. From Judges verse 6, from the New King James Version of the Bible, the sign of the fleece. So Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground around, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. And when he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece together, he wrung the dew out of the fleece, a bowlful of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on all the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, but there was dew on all the ground. If Philip the Good of Burgundy chose the emblem of his order because of the biblical Gideon's actions, then I assume he has done so because of the analogy with the era he lived in, that of the endless crusades succeeding each other. His father John the Fearless had spent 1 year in an Ottoman prison back in his day. The call for the liberation of Constantinople would have been fueled by this personal motivation, next to a possible religious-inspired one. Though this religious reason, I think, should also be regarded as another diplomatic move. He needed the Roman Catholic Church to approve the order's legitimacy. I am not really sure what the connection is, whether it is this fleece or whether it refers to a special item Gideon gave to his troops, namely the shofar. The shofar or shofar. The shofar is a ram's left horn, traditionally used to announce the days Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The first time it sounded was during the storm that broke as Moses came down the mountain with the stone Torah. Gideon handed out such a horn to each member of his 300 men strong army to be used to create chaos during a nightly ambush on the Midianites. So it is written. And with that, I have given it enough attention already for now. Instead, I want to have another look at this jewel worn by the knights. There is the fleece hung over a ring in the middle. The rest of the golden chain is composed of a differing amount of square stylized fire strikers, placed head to tail, interspersed with flint stones from which flames or sparks emerge. The briquet, as the flint iron or fire striker is called in heraldry, is centered over the cross of Burgundy. The slogan accompanying this emblem is Ante ferit quam flamma misset, meaning it strikes before the flame sparks. I found an alternative explanation which proposes that it is a heraldic symbol, that the heraldic symbol of the flint iron is meant to be a stylized representation of the frontal skull bone of a ram, which, if true, would again connect to the mythical ram Chrysomalus that we saw in part 1. So where does the idea of fire strikers come from? Let's take a look at Burgundy Cross first for some clues. Saint Andrew, also known as the Manly, Andrew the Brave, was executed on this kind of cross. Therefore, such crosses are generally called St. Andrew's Cross. When or how the Burgundians chose them as their patron is unclear. I find many references claiming there is no relationship between the Saint's Cross and the Burgundy emblem, and that the designation is wrong. Still, there is apparently a legend that recounts the tale of Etienne, Count of Burgundy, aka Stephen I, who lived during the second half of the 11th century. That legend speaks of a pilgrimage to Marseille. Etienne carried a St. Andrew's cross to a sanctuary dedicated to the Christian martyr Saint Victor. The tale goes Victor was raised by Mary Magdalene. Whatever that may, the official story tells us Victor was a Roman soldier who refused to bring offer to Jupiter and was therefore condemned to be grinded to death under a millstone. Whether there is a link between the two crosses left aside, I read that nobles of that time often tried to overclass their predecessor in the choice of heraldic emblems. John the Fearless, father to Philip the Good, chose to add block planes to the cross used by his own father. In esoteric language, this means that the adversary had to be gradually weakened, or in this case, abraded. Philip replaced the block plane and the wood chips with a fire striker and the flints and the sparks. According to 15th century chronicler Chastelin, his intention was to show that he wanted to pursue his father's policy with more dynamism. The esoteric meaning for this, the wood chips that the block plane makes flying around are lifeless, while the sparks that the iron strikes from the stone are alive. A flint striker works like this. The metal is iron with high carbon contents. As the iron hits the sharp flint edge, small pieces of metal are chipped off and combust, creating the sparks by which inflammable materials can be set alight. I've added a short introduction on that on my fire playlist here on my YouTube channel. But in antiquity, before the Iron Age, often iron pyrites, aka fool's gold, was used to strike the flint. For what it's worth, Wiki tells us that Ötzi the Iceman might have used this to start his fires. On the content of Ötzi's tool bag, again see my fire playlist on this channel. Actually, fire making was known already at least 250,000 years ago for cooking, but also for tool making. The Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and the earliest modern humans knew how to value pyrite and flint. On a side note here, the Chinese have an honorable ancestor going back way before the mythical emperors, who was called Sui Ren. Supposedly he was the inventor of the bow drill. The oldest mention stems from the Han Dynasty and is traced back to some 5,000 years, around the time of Meluha in the Indus Valley civilization, for what it's worth. And it makes you wonder again what knowledge has been lost with all the book burnings happening during our distant past, and not so distant past, and to this day. The fire striker became a common decorative motif in the 15th and early 16th century in all areas belonging to the Great Burgundian territory. In what is commonly called the applied arts, it appears frequently on coats of arms, furniture, tapestry, iron cases, hearthstones, etc. The earliest examples of steel fire strikers stem from the Roman period, all pretty much the same in shape. There are a lot of Nordic or Viking items as well, and examples from the Near East. And most archaeological flint steel finds were dated back to the Middle Ages, when its use had become general. Although some say these iron flint ones are not fire strikers but razors. I don't know about that, but I doubt that shaving a beard can cause iron to wear out like this. They were used until the invention of sulfur matches during the 19th century. I would add there may be another reason why Philip chose to use the flint steel as his emblem, though this one is based on pure speculation. Invented by the Chinese as early as the 9th century, the first time gunpowder was ever mentioned in the West was in the 13th century by Roger Bacon. It was hard to obtain the ingredients of gunpowder such as saltpeter, and this required import from the East. The Arabs called it white dust from China. That possibly is where Bacon got his knowledge from, similar as with the compass. Halfway the 14th century, a German monk alchemist named Berthold Schwarz managed to make the stuff himself, but there appears to be doubt about this because the complete story is untraceable. Is it too far a stretch then to consider that such discoveries and what came forth out of it would be held a secret. Isn't it possible that there were already attempts in trying to fabricate a weapon in which the wick was replaced by flint and steel? I mentioned in part 1 the political move of Philip the Good, marrying Isabella of Portugal, and the impact this marriage had on the economic growth of the city of Bruges. This alliance enabled Venetian merchants to sail around the Iberian Peninsula towards the west of Europe and allowed them to directly trade with the Hanseatic League, which is an international North European maritime trade organization which Bruges was part of. It may be important to note here first that there are two branches of the Order of the Golden Fleece now, a Spanish or Bourbon and an Austrian or Habsburg branch. This split happened in the 17th century. The House of Bourbon, the Spanish branch, uses the two pillars of Hercules on their coins. These pillars symbolize the Gibraltar Straits. The name Pillars of Hercules was used by Strabo to specify a specific geological point, which is generally assumed to be the strait between Spain and Morocco. Others suggest that the name refers to a colony of the earlier Phoenicians, where a temple for their sun god Malkert was built, and it supposedly had in it two copper pillars. That story on its own would fill a complete video. For now, what is important is that the alliance allowed an easy trade route to the Mediterranean, more specifically for Venetian and Genoa merchants. Because of the free passage, the French city of Troyes, often wrongly pronounced Troy, lost their prominent position as trade and banking center and the advantage of Bruges. Now, Bruges is often called Venice of the North, and most people assume this is because of the many canals across the old town. But this alliance stems from the Venetians that settled with their banking houses instead. In the center of the old city, there was a huge trading center called the Lakenhalle. It disappeared over time and was never rebuilt. Traces to the old merchants, however, can still be found in the city center. How long would it take to import the secrets of manufacturing gunpowder together with ingredients when trading conditions are so favorable? Another thing important to take into account is that the participants of the Fourth Crusade in 1204 mostly came from France, Burgundy, Valois, Flanders. To be able to ship the large number of knights and their troops, horses and weapons, the Crusaders needed the help of the Venetians for finances and for the building of a fleet. They conquered the Croatian city Zara, now called Zadar, as part of the trade deal with the Venetian Doge, and set off to conquer Constantinople in favor of a contestant in Venetia of the Byzantine throne. It was after this battle that the library of Byzantium was plundered, the library of Constantinople was plundered, texts and books were brought to the West, and numerous copies were made by monks and scribes. This transfer of knowledge will be regarded as the real set-off for the Enlightenment and the Renaissance of Europe. The supposed goal of this crusade was liberating Jerusalem, but eventually all they did was deliver both Zara and Constantinople to the Venetian Republic, which was now the strongest maritime power of the Mediterranean. During the reign of Philip the Good, 200 years after the Fourth Crusade, Byzantium, or what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire, fell to Mehmed II, aka Mehmed the Conqueror. With the use of cannons, his troops shot holes in the thick city walls. The cannons hurled stone blocks of up to 1200 kilo over a 1 mile range, and it would heat up so much that it could only be shot 3 times a day. This again allowed the defense forces of the city to fill the holes up again with rubble. This went on until the cannons aimed at one of the gates. The city was ransacked and the last emperor died. The Ottomans from then on took control of Constantinople. That was 1453. However, already 2 years earlier in Flanders, a similar cannon was used during a battle between the cities of Ghent and Oudenaarde. The cannon, called Old Meg, can be seen in the old city centre of Ghent. The forging of such a cannon was a high cost. The one used by the Ottomans at Constantinople was called the basilisk, and it was forged by a Hungar called Orban, a namesake of the current president, or prime minister, of Hungary. Orban had first offered the Western forces his craftsmanship, but they declined because of the high costs. Not so Mehmed the Conqueror. These cannons did not work with flint ignition yet, of course, but these I mention these because they serve as an example of the wealth, ingenuity, and energy put into such martial innovation. The earliest form of a handgun, developed with a wheellock, which is also called a doglock pistol, did not have flint ignition yet, but it had a pyrite to hit a steel wheel. These date back to the early 1500s, almost a century after the inception of the Order of the Golden Fleece. It had a very complicated mechanism, a design that would have taken years to develop. Before that, they had firearms with a matchlock, and the time it took to fire such an arm was so long. I can imagine that the development of semi-automatic weapons must have been an urgent one for all parties. Some sources claim that the Chinese played with fireworks for a century or so before it was used to develop weapons. But despite Wiki, there are several sources that will tell you their first cannon was developed already in the 9th century during the Tang dynasty. Quite some time passed before muskets with flint ignition were used in the military. That would have been the 16th century. With the Mongols using gunpowder and cannons in their campaigns, with the knowledge the Arabs had at least as early as the 14th century, and with the best equipped troops that they would meet during the many battles in the Middle East, I doubt Philip and his nobles were not considering the improvement of their weapon arsenal. Military secrets still remain quite impossible to unravel. Of course, I am merely speculating. There is no proof of a weapon using flint or pyrite striker ignition being in development during the 15th century already. Maybe the flint steel that serves as chain for the order was indeed merely referring to the power of fire being more destructive than a wood plane. Maybe it is just a matter of delusion of greatness to which the powerful fall prey, and there is nothing more to it, but still worth a little deviation. But talking about the Mongols, these elaborate examples here of flint iron are definitely not razors. This type of fire strikers is generally called a chakmak, a word which is derived from the Turkic shakmatashi. Though the Tibetan name is Mechag and the Mongolian is Kete, but the word chukmuk is apparently used all over Central Asia. They are hung on the belt and the pouch contains tinder. And they were worn by both men and women in traditional dress until only recently. I tried to find some more on the traditions of the Medes and other fire worshipping cultures. For the region, which is now Iran, is the place of fire worship by far, with Zoroastrianism as the prime example. But since I keep on reading and researching while assembling my videos, I may add more on this as I go along. Regarded, I do find info, of course.